everyone. Welcome to the October 10th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at a loaded weekend of racing from this past week. Just a slew of Breeders' Cup prep races at major venues across the country: New York, Kentucky, California, even a few races up in Canada at Woodbine that we're going to discuss at the end of the show. But Craig, the action came at us pretty fast and consistently throughout this past weekend. A lot to take in, but suddenly it feels like a lot of these Breeders' Cup pictures are a lot more settled than they were, I suppose, if we can say that. They're as settled as they're going to be, but it does feel like we've got a lot of competitive divisions, maybe more so than usual, heading into this year's Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I would agree. This was a really good weekend of racing. We saw some good performances. It's going to be. I know I've seen a lot of talk about the Breeders' Cup and a lot of horses aren't showing up and aren't making it, but I still, as always, there are going to be some really good betting races. Maybe not races that have champions we're going to be talking about for years and years, though I do think we saw one really good horse we'll talk about when we get to Keeneland, obviously. But yeah, I was impressed with several horses I saw run this weekend.
Yeah, obviously a lot of the turf races are going to depend on who's coming in from Europe and Japan and elsewhere. The strength of those races and how the Americans will fare is dependent on those shippers. But some of the premier races, Craig, like the Classic, the Distaff, the Juvenile, I mean, there is no one clear standout in a lot of those divisions, and it feels like those are going to be some really interesting races to handicap as long as some of the fields hold together. We'll talk about how some of those divisions are developing as we go through these prep races. I don't think there were any major preps for the Classic this weekend, but I know we talked about that on the last Pacecast. But we're going to talk about some Distaff preps for the Juvenile, some other races that seem very competitive heading into the Breeders' Cup. So going to be interested to see how all of these horses progress in the upcoming month or so. Well, let's dive into the action, Craig, because we've got a lot to go through. We're going to begin by talking about some races at Aqueduct, the Belmont at the Big A meet. Then we'll move on to Keeneland, where they ran a bunch of races on their opening weekend. Then Santa Anita, and we'll finish up at Woodbine. So let's begin at Belmont at the Big A, and we'll talk about some of those Saturday races that they ran this last weekend. Unfortunately, this situation where it rains every Saturday in New York, that pattern continued this week, and it feels like, unfortunately, it's going to continue next week as well, as somehow there's another heavy rainstorm predicted next weekend. But unfortunately, it did mess up some of the turf racing, Craig, that was planned in the latter half of the weekend. They were able to get in the Grade 1 Joe Hirsch Turf Classic on the grass. Thankfully, it was carded early in the day on Saturday, so they were able to run that, even though it was raining throughout the card on Saturday at Aqueduct. And the horse that really seemed to appreciate that going, Craig, is Warlike Goddess, who was able to win this race for the second year in a row. She's just one of these horses that seems to really relish the mile-and-a-half distance, and she's able to get that distance, often racing against the males, and she's run some of her best races against the boys. She's winning this race for the second year in a row, ran well in last year's Breeders' Cup Turf, and it sounds like that's where they're going to point again off of this victory.
It was a very impressive performance from her, and I think the key is she got some pace. Often when she runs in those filly and mare races, they're short fields. There seems like there's never any speed in here. Well, in this race, obviously, we got pace on like high octane when So High just ran off and opened up a huge lead on the field. And to the credit of that rider, Romero Mirage, it was just a that was what he had to do, and actually wound up getting third, getting a Grade 1 placing. For a while, it looked like he might actually hang on, so I wish we would see more of that in turf racing, particularly from long shots, because we often see him kind of back in the placings this way. Not really back into it, he earned it. I mean, just by going out, setting the fast pace, and sapped the kick of a lot of horses in here. And Warlike Goddess, I mean, she ran well. She got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure. Just demolished the field, including last year's Breeders' Cup Turf winner, Rebels Romance, who really wasn't a factor. He was a little closer chasing the pace, but just had nothing left in the stretch. Stone Age was a horse we saw compete in the Breeders' Cup Turf last year, so I don't think it's out of the question that she could run well. I know this was over a yielding turf course, but she's run fine on more firm turf in the past. So just a really good effort that sets her up nice for the Breeders' Cup. The one question I would have is, does Junior Alvarado keep the mount? Because for whatever reason, Joel Rosario just doesn't seem to fit this horse very well either, in my opinion. And I know a lot of people have pointed out some rides that weren't the greatest, and the last, I think it's 3 times she's had a different rider, have been what I'd consider her best races.
Yeah, that's a good point about her. Maybe she likes something new, but no, I would imagine Junior is going to keep the ride. He certainly has other mounts for Belmont at the Breeders' Cup, Cody's Wish, the 2-year-old we're going to talk about in just a little bit. So certainly it feels like Junior Alvarado has risen in the ranks, and now he's riding a lot of the best horses for Mott. So I would imagine he's going to keep the mount on Warlike Goddess going into the Breeders' Cup turf. Initially, Craig, I was expecting this fig to come back a little bit higher, just given the stature of this race and the fact that she won it by nearly 5 lengths. But and it's funny, we were just talking about speed figures on the turf before we started recording, kind of having a philosophical discussion about whether the best turf horses are as good as the best dirt horses and how the figs should compare to each other. A topic for another time. But as I was thinking about it more, this turf division generally, at least the Americans, has been fairly weak, and Rebel's Romance, who was her main rival in this race, just clearly didn't fire with his best shot. I don't know if it was the turf condition he didn't appreciate or just the manner in which the race was run with that runoff leader, maybe having him come off the bridle earlier than he really wanted to, but clearly he just did not run his race. And horses like Soldier Rising and So High and the others who finished in behind, I mean, they're just never going to be among the elites that are competitive on an international level. So even though Warlike Goddess won this race by a substantial margin, I get why it's not like a 130 TimeformUS speed figure for her in this race. But I agree. I still think she's fairly interesting heading into the Breeders' Cup turf. I don't know if she got the best trip in that race last year, and this year's Breeders' Cup Turf in all likelihood is going to be a stronger race than last year because I imagine there are going to be better Europeans than Rebel's Romance coming over this year. But still, she's a really nice horse who typically shows up in these mile-and-a-half races, and I'll be interested to see what she does out at Santa Anita. And I'll just add, I agree with everything you were saying about So High, Craig. I love when horses get enterprising rides like that. Often, especially in these longer turf races, when you utilize a horse's natural speed, they overachieve. We saw it in this race, and also we saw it in the Weah earlier on the card when a Chad Brown Rabbit, who looked vastly inferior to her stablemate, went out, opened up early, and was able to hold on for second over rivals that were supposed to beat her in that race. So, when you've got some give in the ground and you've got some other horses that have questionable stamina, using horses' speed is often a good thing. And just one more thing as we wrap up this race, Craig. I see there are no pace figures in for this Turf Classic. I imagine it was a tough race to make speed figures for, with I think just one race run on each course at Aqueduct on Saturday. And I'm guessing there was a run-up issue with the fact that there are no pace figures for this race.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. The reason there are none is because this was the first time they've run a mile and a half on the outer turf. So there's no baseline whatsoever to base them on. So maybe, you got to run at least a few before I'm comfortable making pace figures, and there had not been any.
Let's move on to some of the other Grade 1 action on that Saturday card at Aqueduct. The Grade 1 Champagne for the 2-year-old males was won in decisive fashion by Timberlake. And obviously, Craig, you want to see these horses do it on a fast track like they are most likely to get in Southern California for the Breeders' Cup. But unfortunately, this race was run over a sloppy track, as I think the Champagne has been in the last couple of years. But I wouldn't take too much away from Timberlake's performance because he's a horse that had shown ability on a fast track in the past. Obviously, the Hopeful didn't work out for him for a number of reasons. Trip, Keen with the blinkers, just a race that generally got a lower speed figure than I think people were expecting, maybe due to the pace. But I think this is some evidence that we're going to see horses running a little faster out of the Hopeful than maybe that speed figure they got that day suggested. And boy, Timberlake did not seem to have any trouble handling the added distance here.
No, he was good. I think I remember you talking about him, one of his workouts, and you predicted he would be a Grade 1 winner soon. Didn't work out in the Hopeful, but it just took another extra race. But yeah, really good performance from him. I guess you have to question it a little bit that because it's an off track, as you said, but it's not like he hadn't run big races before. So he's looking very good to me. He's obviously a big threat if he goes in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And like you said, that Hopeful's looking stronger. Not just him. There were a couple other horses run decent races out of it this weekend. Not necessarily winning, but running better speed figures. So yeah, good race by Timberlake. He got a 113 time form US speed figure, so he matched his prior maiden breaking win, and the future is bright with this one because he handled the two turns, no problem, or not two turns, but handled the added distance, no problem at all.
Yeah, and you mentioned two turns. I guess that's going to be a question for this horse, having never tried it before, as it always is with the runners coming out of New York. But I don't have too many questions about it with Timberlake. I mean, he just feels like a horse that is going to want even more ground. I know he's buying to mischief, but there's a lot of stamina on the bottom side of his pedigree, and he just finishes so powerfully. He just looks more grown up and developed than a lot of the horses that he's running against right now. And I also like that he was so much more professional in this race than he was in the Hopeful. They took the blinkers off. He relaxed much better, even though he didn't break as sharply once again. That's a minor concern with him. He doesn't get out of the gate that first step as quickly as some other horses. But I really liked the way that he came through between horses and just sustained that finish. General Partner also ran well, but he does feel like one that might ultimately have some distance limitations. I think they are going to go on to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile with him. At least he was on the list of probables that I got yesterday, but it feels like maybe added distance or is not going to be his friend, and I wonder if he might be a horse that's better around one turn next year.
Yeah, I can see that. He was my pick in the race. He ran fine. He just wasn't good enough to beat Timberlake, and he wasn't exactly finishing the strongest. So I kind of echo your distance concerns. So I get giving him a shot in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, the big disappointment in this race was Fierceness, who went off as the crazy 2-5 favorite off his impressive maiden victory at Saratoga. Didn't get the best trip. I mean, got a poor start, then sort of bumped between horses and always out of position. He didn't fire, though, so I imagine they'll regroup with him, and hopefully he comes back in maybe a shorter race and can prove that his debut was no fluke. The Grade 1 Frisette, run at the same distance over the same sloppy track at Aqueduct earlier in the day, was won by the undefeated Belmont trainee. Just FYI, this one going out for the exact same connections, ownership, and everything to Warlike Goddess. And, Craig, this filly hasn't yet run that fast a race, but I have liked the way that she's accomplished both of her victories. She seems like one that is not going to appreciate even more ground. She's this big, lanky daughter of Justify, and obviously skipped over the slop here, but she handled a fast track on debut, and it just feels like in general the Breeders' Cup Juvenile fillies probably isn't coming into the Breeders' Cup as strong a race as the Juvenile for the males, with the lone exception of that filly out in California, Tamara. So it's kind of wide open, so I'm not going to knock her too much for not running that fast the number yet.
No, and I think she had an excuse given the pace of this race. It was a crawl fest. All the fractions in blue, the early pace figures in the low 80s. So, as we've talked about in the past, it's kind of hard to run really good speed figures. Her final time figure was a 102. She got a 99 pace adjusted, but I like how she did it. This was a nice selection by you off her debut, where she won being wide around both turns, and she was also wide around the turn here. I said both. I keep saying two turns. She was wide around the one turn here, lost a lot of ground, and it didn't seem to matter. So it seems like distance won't be any issue with her, and I would imagine that she can run, even at this point, several points faster than we've already seen her run.
And the runner-up, Central Avenue, is a horse that I want to mention, just given what you were talking about with the pace, just a race where all the fractions were color-coded in blue. I mean, she was able to close from last and was still finishing at the end to pass Life Talk for second in the final eighth of a mile. Again, I don't know if she's going to be a horse that's going to find success in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. That might be coming up too soon for her. But she's a nice finisher who might have a say in some longer two-turn races next year.
Yeah, no doubt. And she didn't, we talked about her trip when we did a race preview for this one. She didn't have the greatest trip that day, being well off the pace early. It wasn't much of a pace and still being able to get the job done. And another who seems like two turns wouldn't be any problem for her.
Let's go back to Wednesday of the prior week at Belmont at the Big A, and we'll talk about some of those turf races for the 2-year-olds that are preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf and Juvenile Fillies Turf. These were supposed to be run the prior weekend, but they rescheduled them for this Wednesday when there was a brief bright spot in the forecast. Actually able to run these races over some reasonably firm turf courses. The Miss Grillo for the 2-year-old fillies was won by the Chad Brown trained Hard to Justify. This was a horse who had gotten a a subtle trip on debut at Saratoga and still won that race, and obviously much more professional and showing better tactical speed this day as she got a good ride from the inside by Flavien Prat to send her forward. And I think that made the difference in a race where horses that were trying to rally from the back of the pack, Craig, did not find that much success.
No, they didn't. And I just want to lodge a brief complaint that I was very happy to see they were running the Miss Grillo and the Pilgrim on the same day, something they hadn't done in the past, or at least the recent past. But unfortunately, they ran them on two different turf courses, so it made it extremely tough to make speed figures for these. You do the best you can, but there were other turf races run, so it was a little disappointing. They probably could have juggled it around a little bit to get these both the same, but they did not, so we do what we can. And Hard to Justify ran a good race, now 2 for 2. Increased her speed figure quite a bit to get a 101. As you said, there wasn't a whole lot of movement in here other than the leader kind of dropping anchor, and the others, the top three, were 2, 3, 4 early. So there wasn't much movement. So I don't know really what to make of this race, but the speed figure says she's pretty good. That's a decent number for a 2-year-old filly this time of year.
Yeah, I just thought she ran a nice race. The runner-up, Life's Inaudible, also got a good trip. She was on the rail early, moved to the 2-path on the far turn, and finished up decently. Didn't seem like she was really going to get by Hard to Justify in the stretch. That filly for Chad Brown was really digging in and finishing at the end of this race. But they both ran respectable speed figures. The favorites in this race, I thought, neither got ideal trips. Galibrand was just sort of a little keen early, and then Jose Ortiz dragged her back to last on the backstretch to, I guess, try to get her to relax, but she was always too far out of position to make an impact on this race. And Memorialize, who was vying for favoritism, she was just 3 to 4 wide around both turns towards the back, so tough trip for both of those. Probably it's going to cost them a shot at going to the Breeders' Cup. Well, maybe not so for Galibrand, because she's already got a stakes victory under her belt, but we'll see how that all develops in the upcoming weeks. The Pilgrim, as you said, Craig, run on the same car, but on a different course, was contested for the 2-year-old males. And it just kind of feels like in the turf division, or at least it's felt this way in New York this year, that the fillies have been a little bit stronger. The Miss Grillo just felt like a stronger field going in, and you kind of see that in the speed figures here as Agate Road, the winner of the Pilgrim, gets a lower number in 93. But this horse, he does have a strong finish on him. I mean, he's still a little goofy and is learning things, but I thought he ran a more professional race on this day to get the job done. I just don't really know what was behind him in this spot.
No, and he also got a very good pace setup. This was a race with all the fractions in red. And again, it would have been nice if they ran these races on the same course so we could compare them more directly, but we can't. So, I mean, I would be a little leery basing my opinions on the speed figures, no matter who makes them, whether it's me, Bayer, or some other company outside of DRF, because they're just very difficult. You're making them mostly on just 2-year-olds who are improving. So, like I said, we do what we can with them. I tend to agree with you. I think the fillies are better, so I don't want to totally discount the speed figures here, but it's largely based on what they had run coming into the race. Agate Road gets a 93. We didn't even have a figure for him last time. I forget the exact reason. I think it was all 2-year-old first-time starters, and maybe the only turf race on the course the last time, so it was impossible. So didn't really have much to base his on, but he looked professional. I would be a little leery of betting him, though, given the perfect setup that he had with the pace.
Yeah, I was just doing my early lines for the Breeders' Cup Friday races this morning, which get posted on DRF.com, and it was kind of striking to me how slow this 2-year-old colt division on the turf is in general. I mean, we're going to talk about a few of these races, and none of them have gotten particularly fast speed figures, so I don't want to completely write off Agate Row, but it feels like if a good Euro comes over, this division in particular could be somewhat vulnerable. On Friday at Belmont at the Big A, they ran the listed Geoponte Stakes. This one just attracted a small field, only 5 runners, but it does feel like the winner of this race, Northern Invader, is a pretty good horse for trainer Cherie DeVoe, and just yet another 3-year-old in this turf division, Craig, that has been running fast speed figures. I mean, it feels like there is unusual depth of talent in this division. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of the horses. We've been talking about it basically all year, going all the way back to the winter at Gulfstream, but just feels like some really talented 3-year-olds. I don't know if they're all pointing to the Breeders' Cup or how many of them are, but it feels like the kind of year where we could see more 3-year-olds stepping up against older horses earlier and having success.
Yeah, and we certainly have a good division to look forward to as they turn in the older horses next year because, as we know, turf horses don't get rushed off to the breeding shed very often. So it's really kind of exciting to see so many good wins. And Northern Invaders, yet another win. He had kind of blown us away with that 111 when he broke his maiden at Belmont in early summer. Disappointed in the Virginia Derby, didn't have the best trip that day, but boy did he rebound here all the way up to a big 122 Timeform US speed figure. Had no problem handling the course this day. So yeah, I like what I saw from him, and just another one that has plenty of talent. And I mean, it's not like he he has excuse me, I lost my train of thought. He's very tractable in that he can be taken off the pace, he can be on the pace, or very close to it anyway. So a very bright future for this one.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I imagine a lot of these 3-year-olds with talent are going to be pointing to that Grade 1 Hollywood Derby towards the end of the year at Del Mar. That always seems like it comes up a strong race, and I feel like especially so this year with so much talent out there in the division. On Sunday at Belmont at the Big A, unfortunately, all of the races were off the turf. I just think that was unavoidable given the amount of rain that fell on Saturday. And really unfortunate to lose some prep races for the Breeders' Cup, especially for the 2-year-olds, just given how many 2-year-old races have been rained off the turf in New York this year. It's just really unfortunate to lose stakes races in this division, but unfortunately that was the case with both the Futurity and the Matron. We'll discuss the Futurity, which was run on the dirt, because I think the winner of this race on the dirt is actually pretty good, Craig. Bookham Dano, New Jersey bred, who had won both starts of his career so far in New Jersey, took that form to New York and just dominated an overmatched group here.
He did. We don't see many Jersey breds this day, but he's a pretty good one. He's now won all 3 races by open lengths and jumped his speed figure all the way up from a 99 to a 109 this time. He's a horse who doesn't need to lead. He comes from off the pace in all of his races. Had had some pretty slow paces his first two, and didn't get that here. It was just kind of an honest pace and didn't seem to matter. As you said, we don't really know what was in behind him. There weren't the horses behind him hadn't run great speed figures on the dirt or had been winning on turf. So not the strongest field, but the visual is good. He looks like a pretty good horse.
Yeah, I know his connections did want to run him on the turf. He's a son of more of a turf sire, and I think they want to experiment with that before committing to going to some longer races on the dirt. So I think they had intentions to go to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint, but that might not be the case now because I don't think these races stay win-and-you're-in races when they're rained off the turf. So we'll see where they decide to go with him, but he's a horse that has talent. And the other race on Sunday that's worth mentioning in terms of Breeders' Cup implications was the Grade 2 Beldame earlier in the day. Unfortunately, another very small field, only 4 horses contesting this one, and it played out as a pretty anticlimactic race with nobody really going after randomized on the front end. The heavy favorite, I mean, that's, I guess, not a big surprise when you're the lone speed and heavy favorite in a race these days. But it just didn't turn out to be much of a test for this horse, Craig. I mean, nice to see her win again after beating a nice field of 3-year-old fillies in the Alabama. And she technically did step up and beat older rivals here, but not the best older fillies and mares out there. And she's going to face, in all likelihood, a much tougher pace scenario in the Breeders' Cup Distaff.
Yeah, she's one. I mean, she's fine. I liked her in the Alabama. She paid off handsomely that day, but yeah, she took a little bit step back speed figure wise from a 119 to a 115. I wouldn't read too much into that given how easily she won. But she's going to have to step it up again. I doubt she will be alone on the front end if she were to show up in the Breeders' Cup. And the older division is definitely a bit tougher than what we've seen from the 3-year-olds.
Let's move on to Keeneland, where there's plenty of racing to discuss from this past weekend. Let's start on Sunday, since we're already talking about the Breeders' Cup Distaff Division. And, I used the word anticlimactic for the Beldam. I probably should have used it instead for the Spinster, Craig, because this was supposed to be the rematch between Idiomatic and Nest. Nest obviously having been beaten by that foe, upset in the personal ensid when arguably Nest didn't handle the wet track as well as Idiomatic, but it didn't turn into much of a rematch because Nest just never looked like she was traveling well in this race, was really never in the mix at all, and Idiomatic was just able to dominate on the front end, set her own pace, kick away at the end, not dissimilar from the way that Randomized won the Beldam, and another horse that's going to be coming into the Breeders' Cup Distaff, likely facing some speed pressure that she hasn't met in her prep races leading into it.
No, I would say the one difference is she's been a little bit faster than Randomized, both early and speed figure wise. She gets her second consecutive 122 for this effort here. So yeah, I think she's pretty good. It's hard to say if she gets challenged on the front end, but she's a filly who's been running good all year, running nice speed figures. So I would consider her a more likely winner than Randomized, but if horses like that hook up on the front end, it could damage both their chances. Nest, she never looked like she was in this race. I mean, I would say after a furlong, it was pretty obvious she wasn't winning, never really made a dent at all, and just seems like she has not come back the same horse as a 4-year-old as she was at 3.
Yeah, Craig, I guess at this point, is Idiomatic the favorite for the Breeders' Cup Distaff? It's hard to really know. Nest has sort of fallen by the wayside. Clairiere was a complete no-show in the personal ensign, though I guess she could bounce back, especially with a favorable pace setup. Secret Oath has been retired. There are some 3-year-old fillies out there, like Pretty Mischievous, but it doesn't feel like she's the kind of horse that could be favored in this race. I guess it could be Idiomatic or maybe even a Dare Manor, who I know we had sort of been dismissing all year, but suddenly she looks like a serious player in the Breeders' Cup, and she's another one that has speed, has been enjoying some uncontested leads in her race out west, but I guess she's got that home court advantage. So the Distaff, in a weird way, is setting up as one of the more intriguing Breeders' Cup races of all.
Yeah, I'm not even sure who the field's going to be. I assume Clairiere is going to show up, and I'm a little hesitant to write her off that bad effort because she came into the Breeders' Cup last year off a pretty long layoff and a bad effort. Not necessarily bad. She had some trouble that day, but it's not like Steve Asmussen can't train her up to the Breeders' Cup. Something I hate saying, but I guess that's a plan with her. And I would imagine between her and Idiomatic, that's where the favoritism's going to go.
Yeah, fascinating race that I'm looking forward to handicapping. Hopefully all of these horses stay healthy in the next month. Let's talk about some of that Saturday racing at Keeneland. And you mentioned a really talented horse, Craig, towards the start of the podcast. I assume you were talking about the winner of the Grade 1 Coolmore Turf Mile, Up to the Mark. And this was a thrilling race because when you've got horses like this that had shown so much talent and then sort of go to the sidelines with some mysterious ailment, you really do wonder if they're going to come back in the same form, and it was heartening to see Up to the Mark return with the same kind of electrifying turn of foot that we had seen from him earlier in the year, and he was running down a pretty good horse here in Master of the Seas.
Yeah, outstanding training job by Todd Pletcher. I know that's not a big surprise, but Up to the Mark came right back. I was wondering on our forecast if maybe this was more a prep to get him ready for the Breeders' Cup Mile, and if it was, we may have a horse who can contend with the Euros that ship over because Up to the Mark is really good. He ran a 127 TimeformUS speed figure again. He's a horse who's shown he doesn't have to run a mile. He's stretched that out all the way to a mile and a quarter. I think the plan earlier was to try to get him ready for the Breeders' Cup Turf, but obviously I don't think that's going to happen at this point. But the top two are really good horses, and it was a photo I wouldn't have wanted to call. I don't remember if Kurt Becker did or not call that photo, but it was so tight. Normally, I can tell watching on TV. I had no idea who won this one. Up to the Mark wound up getting his nose in front, but and I would argue he had a worse trip than the winner, who saved all the ground, was able to slip through inside. Didn't save all the ground early, but he saved ground on the second turn, got through, and just got run down by a horse who was a little bit better on Saturday.
Yeah, I think the only one to call it was Jose Ortiz because he celebrated after the wire like he knew that he won. I mean, sometimes jockeys do have a feel for that thing, but yeah, really impressive turn of foot. I mean, and it was the kind of ride that I think you could have easily criticized Jose for if he hadn't gotten up, because this horse was not in the best spot at a few points. I mean, it looked like he had nowhere to go on the far turn. He was trying to angle out at the top of the stretch, had to alter course a couple of times, and I wouldn't even say it was a great ride by Jose Ortiz as much as Up to the Mark just bailed him out, because he always had another kick once he found clear running, and he was able to get up and beat that strong finisher at the end of the race. Just a really awesome performance, and it doesn't sound like they are confirmed to go to the Breeders' Cup Mile. I think they're leaving the door open to maybe contest the turf, Craig. I don't know. I mean, I guess at Santa Anita, you do have a little more leeway to stretch out in distance. I mean, the 1.5 miles at Santa Anita, I think, is just a little less taxing from a stamina standpoint, perhaps, than maybe it would be at Keeneland or another venue where the turf course, it does it has favors less horses with that turn of foot. So we'll see where they decide to go with Up to the Mark. But whatever Breeders' Cup race they decide to contest, I'll be interested to see how he does, because he clearly is the most talented turf horse of the Americans.
Yeah, and I think that 1.5 miles includes a down the hill portion, which effectively shortens the race a little bit, unless that's changed, but I don't think it has.
And Craig, you gave this race, I don't know if we mentioned it, a 1:27 TimeformUS speed figure. I know you wanted to mention the relative times and the speed figures of the Coolmore Turf Mile versus the First Lady, which we'll talk about next. Both of these races, grade ones, run at a mile on the turf. And the First Lady did come up with a faster final time, but the Coolmore Turf Mile got the higher speed figure. So as we transition to the First Lady, you can sort of explain that.
Yeah, it's one where you couldn't really do a direct comparison between the two because they use different run-ups. If you look in the chart, they're listed as 65 and 85. That may not seem like a big difference, but I actually think it's bigger than that. I think it's between 35 and 40 feet different. And it's also in that sweet spot where, I mean, if the run-up was 200 feet and the difference was 20 feet or 30 feet, it wouldn't make much of a difference. If the run up was 10 and 40, it would make a gigantic difference. This one's kind of in the middle where it just can make a moderate difference, but in my opinion, it was enough to sway the speed figures a little bit. Somebody did reach out to me from Keeneland. They saw the tweet I made about it, and they said they're going to try not to do that in the future. It was just apparently something that didn't occur to the person that placed the gate, that maybe it would be an issue for bettors, but I think it's a pretty big one, and I think it's a really good move that they said they would try not to do that unless there's damage caused by the first race, like if it was a really off track or something. So good on Keeneland for that. I was really happy to hear that, and glad to know that there are some people out there that listen. That said, I rated the First Lady just a couple points lower. Gina Romanica ran a 125 TimeformUS speed figure. Looked like the Gina Romanica we saw last year. We hadn't really seen that from her this year. She'd run decent in her races, but hadn't found the winner's circle. But she's one who just rebounded. And it turns out, as we'll get to later on the show, the horse she lost to is pretty darn good last time, too. So that one's proven to be a bit of a key race. In Italian, I've got no knocks on her. She just got run down by her stablemate, who was a little bit better on this day. She set her usual pretty fast pace. When I saw the fractions, I was a little surprised, maybe thinking she was going too slow, but the pace figures indicate otherwise, all in the 130s. And I think that's the best way to ride her. It just wasn't good enough to beat her stablemate.
Yeah, Craig, I would have loved to have made a case for Gina Romantica because I've been a fan of this horse. I don't know exactly where this performance came from based on her prior two efforts this year, because I didn't think she got the best. I mean, I've talked about this. I didn't think she got the best trip at Monmouth off the layoff, and I just was hoping for better from her last time in that Beverly D. But maybe turning back to the mile was really key for her, the less distance, and getting back to Keeneland, where she had run the best race of the year last year, winning that Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, because she produced quite a finish to get up, did get a great ride and trip from Tyler Gaffaliode, saving ground most of the way before angling out. And as you said, in Italian, while she was going what's usually a comfortable pace for her on the front end, it's not like she was just walking on the lead. She did get some token pressure from that long shot, and she kicked away at the top of the stretch, but just did not have quite enough to hold off that charge of Gina Romantica. I guess the disappointment in this race was White Beam, who ran okay, but just seemed uncomfortable at most stages of the race. I don't know what was going on with her. It seemed like she was lugging in. It just felt like Flavien Prat couldn't ever really ride her in the stretch. I mean, he just kind of hand rode her to the wire. It just seemed like something was upsetting her throughout the race. So not the best performance from her. And shout out to Evie Jets, who finished third in here. Just a really cool horse for a barn that's easy to root for. The American Kentromasi stable, who claimed her for, I think, $75,000 or $80,000 a couple of years ago. And I mean, she's just been a real overachiever, and cool to see her get a grade 1 placing. And Craig, as we move on, I do want to just mention, it sounds like in Italian, there's a strong chance she could go to the Breeders' Cup Mile against the males. I think this year that would be the much better race for her than the filly and mare turf, even though I think they're leaving the door open to both. I think the Mile is just the race that she's more naturally suited to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We talked about it. I think that her best distance is probably shorter. She got beat by what, a head. I mean, it's not the end of the world. She's going to be a pace factor, and in California, I would imagine she'll be a little tougher to run down than she would be at Keeneland.
I think that's a great point. The shorter stretch of that mile race in Santa Anita, I think, could suit her a little bit better. And often those races don't attract that much front-running speed, so we'll see where they decide to go with her. The 2-year-olds were in action in the Grade 1 Breeders' Futurity, also on this Saturday card. And, Craig, I guess there are a couple ways to look at this performance by Locked. He did take a slight step backwards from a speed figure standpoint off his visually impressive maiden win, and a lot was expected of him after he won that race at Saratoga by such a wide margin, and looked like the kind of horse that was just going to be an easy winner of his prep for the Breeders' Cup off that race. He had to work for it, but I think he overcame some adversity in doing so, and you could sort of give him the excuse of having that wide trip, though I wouldn't knock him too much just based on the fact that he only won this race by half a length.
No, I'm not going to either. I think that's one of the short stretch races at Keeneland. He actually ran the same speed figure this time. He had run a 110. He ran a 110 here. But for a 2-year-old, you would expect him to move forward a little. But I echo everything you're saying. I don't think it was the easiest trip in the world. I do worry a little bit in a race like the Breeders' Cup. He could get lost a little bit early, and it might be tougher at Santa Anita to make up that ground. But he's certainly one with a bright future. And he's one that they're going to have to deal with. I just have to see the field he draws in against, because there's some other good ones. We've already talked about Timberlake. We're going to talk about another one when we move to Santa Anita. So he's going to have his work cut out in a couple weeks.
Yeah, maybe it's my East Coast bias, Craig, but I think my initial impression of some of these 2-year-olds are that the East Coast horses are a little stronger. Maybe the speed figures say otherwise. I think they do. And the West Coast horses certainly have that home court advantage moving into the Breeders' Cup. But it's going to be interesting to see how Locked and Timberlake stack up against the duo from the Bob Baffert stable. We'll talk about Moothmore in just a little bit. But I agree with what you were saying about the wide trip in this race. And game effort by the runner-up, the Wine Steward, but he did get a much better trip than Locked. He was saving ground early, was able to make his move earlier, whereas Locked had to go legitimately 5 wide around the far turn to make that rush. And I think Locked was sort of, hampering himself a little bit in mid-stretch by sort of not realizing the turn had ended, and he was sort of lugging into the Wine Steward coming off that turn. But once Jose Ortiz got him straightened out for that short stretch run, he was sort of going away from that rival a little bit at the end of the race. So I certainly think he's one that could take another step forward moving on to the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, and the real disappointment here had to be Awesome Road, who was the second choice. And like fierceness, he just showed how tough it can be to come off that one race maiden win at 6 furlongs, stretching out, facing better company. It's something you should always be leery of taking a short price on.
Earlier in the card at Keeneland on Saturday, we saw the Grade 2 Woodford. This one, 5.5 furlong turf sprint, prep for the Breeders' Cup turf sprint. And Boy, Craig, I feel like having handicapped races with Arzak in them for so long, you just kind of assume that he's a horse that's going to get unlucky or break slowly, get a poor trip. But now twice in a row, the trips have worked out for Arzak, and it turns out when he gets the right trip, he's pretty good because he won that race at Saratoga to big price 2 back, and he improved on it to beat this field here pretty decisively. But you could tell he was going to win this race from a long way out because he was just sitting in the perfect spot given the way the pace played out.
Yeah, it was a nice ride by Joel Rosario, no doubt. And I mean, I'm not sure where this race came from because he exploded to a 124 Timeform US speed figure. I know he's had some trips in the past, but it's not like he's a 3 year old. He's a 5 year old who has just kind of been running the same races over and over again until this one. If he's able to reproduce it, it could make him certainly a contender in a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. But I don't know if 5 furlongs will be his thing, but 5.5 certainly was. So he's in top form.
Yeah, 5 furlongs at Santa Anita is definitely a different kind of race than 5.5 furlongs at Keeneland with the long stretch that they do have in Lexington. So I think it could be a different sort of result for Arzak, as well as the 4th place finisher in this race, Livin' the Dream, Craig, whose connections have been very explicit that they want to go to the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint with this horse. They think the 5 furlongs at Santa Anita is ideally suited to him. And based on the way he ran in this Woodford, I can't argue with them because he might have run the best race of anybody, just given the way the pace played out. They were absolutely flying through that opening quarter mile. There was a long shot that sort of went on the suicide mission after him and I think cost Livin' the Dream the race, but he hung in there for a long time in the stretch.
Yeah, he was pretty good. He showed, you had mentioned he had shown real speed in Europe, and he did so here. And I would argue, if not for the 70 to 1 shot, showing that kind of speed and giving him a fight all the way into the stretch, that it could have been even much tougher for him to run down. Speed figure wise, he got the second best speed figure. You don't get huge pace upgrades going 5.5 because you're almost always going fast, but he got a pretty big one of 7 points, which is about as big as you're going to get at that shorter distance. So it tells you how fast they were going. The early pace figure was over 160. So I mean that's just absolutely flying. And I would imagine he's going to be dangerous at Santa Anita.
Let's talk about some more of the 2-year-old action from this past weekend at Keeneland. On Friday, they ran the Grade 1 Alcibiades. This one, Craig, a bit of a surprise as Bright Work just did not handle the 2 turns at all. I think she was a horse that, had developed a bit of a bandwagon after having won 4 in a row to start her career, winning those 2 graded stakes races at Saratoga. But sometimes that form just doesn't translate from sprints to routes, and she clearly was done a long way out in this race. And I thought Vivi's Dream ran well, but could not hold off the late charge of the Todd Pletcher-trained Candide, who was stretching out off a sprint debut win and clearly had no trouble getting the extra ground.
Yeah, that's a move that didn't work very well for Todd Pletcher in a couple of other spots, but it certainly did in this one. She ran a 101 Timeform US speed figure, just a point faster. And really, I mean, she was just as fast as the 2 horses favored coming in, just a couple points below them on debut. So not a big surprise. Not that I don't think this was a particularly strong race. I guess we'll see soon, but I'd probably be looking in different directions in the Breeders' Cup.
Well, I mean, the way the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies is shaping up, Craig, is it's Tamra, the Richard Mandela, daughter of Beholder, and everybody else. I mean, because I made my line for the race this morning, and it's pretty clear that Candide is the second choice. I mean, there's just nobody else that's run a fast number out there. And this was a solid performance, and it feels like she's oars that we probably haven't seen the best of yet. She was still green in this race. She was hanging on her left lead in the stretch. Vivi's Dream did battle back pretty well at the end, but it always seemed like Candide had her measure. So I won't be surprised when Candide is able to take another step forward in the Breeders' Cup, but it does feel like they're all going to have to improve to beat Tamara, because we've only seen her twice, but both of those performances at Del Mar were really impressive, and she's one that certainly isn't supposed to have any trouble getting a little bit of added ground. So definitely feels like she's the boss of this division right now. Let's move on to the Grade 2 Jessamine. This a prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. And this one was won by a pretty promising filly in Buku, who had lost her turf debut. And unfortunately, I bet her the lone time that she lost on the turf. She got just a poor trip that day and was never able to really do any running. But since then, when she's gotten better trips, we've seen what she can do on the turf. And she's pretty talented on this surface. And she came with a big late run to win her maiden race at Churchill. And the same thing here, Craig, even against the tougher field, she was last at the quarter pole and ran by the entire field on the outside, seemingly in the blink of an eye, to win this race going away at the end.
Even if I hadn't watched the race, it would be impressive seeing the 105 and that she drew the 10 hole. But when you see, I mean, she was pretty wide most of the way. Yeah, I was pretty blown away by how she was able to still finish off this race. I mean, had it been a mile and an eighth, she might have won by 10 lengths the way she was pulling away from him. So just a very, very impressive trip given that post draw and the improved competition. And I just really liked what I saw from Buku, and I think she's a major factor at Santa Anita.
Yeah, we've seen some progeny of Justify having more success lately, both on the dirt and the turf, and she is one of them, and just a really impressive mover, the way she finishes off her races, and I think that's something that you see a lot from the Justifies. They're big, powerful horses with long strides, and she is definitely in that mold. With a horse that comes from as far back as she does, you don't always have to worry about trips in a race like the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf, which typically has a full or oversubscribed field, but there's no doubt that she's got quite a bit of talent. The Bourbon was run on Sunday. This another Grade 2 event, the counterpart to the Jessamine, this one for the males. And another winner that came from far back in the pack, Can Group, also last coming around the far turn, but was able to pick his way through the pack to get up at the wire. Though, Craig, it felt coming in like this was a race that, just a lot of the horses hadn't run quite as fast, and even afterwards, it just feels like maybe this male division of two-year-old turf horses isn't quite as strong as the fillies, kind of like what we talked about in New York. So you want to see Can Group step up against the tougher field, but you have to respect the way he finished this race.
Yeah, you do. I mean, he only gets a 97 Timeform US speed figure, so nowhere near what Buku ran on Friday. This race took place on Sunday, as you said, but decent enough effort. He did have a little more pace to run into. I should note there were no times taken during this race, but I was able to video time it. It was very easy to time, so I'm really confident in the times that I came up with. They I think are actually in the chart now if you look it up, the ones I did for Equibase, and yeah, it just was not a very fast race. I guess you could give extra credit for him coming from dead last, but it seemed like he got a fairly decent trip before coming out late, and I'm just not sure how strong this field was, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. He did get a very good trip and ride, saving ground, finding the splits when he needed to get up at the finish. Noted who was second is a horse that we've seen a few times on both the dirt and the turf, and he's okay. But it does feel like some of the horses coming out of this race will have a little bit to prove, and it's a lot tougher, I think, to make that last to first move at Santa Anita than it is at Keeneland, Craig. So some of these horses who have been, showing these deep closing running styles among the 2-year-olds, they could have a tougher trip coming to the mountain, the Breeders' Cup. Move on to the Grade 2 Phoenix. I think this race was run back on Friday, and we could probably move through this one pretty quickly. Craig, Hoist the Gold finally got the first stakes victory of his career. I think he's been knocking on the door quite often in these stakes races, getting minor awards, and he won this race that technically is a prep for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, but I'd be surprised if this race had any strong implications towards the Sprint.
Yeah, it was just the fourth win of his career, and I think his debut win was by disqualification, so he's only crossed the wire first three times. I mean, he's fine. He gets a 118 Timeform US speed figure for the win. I personally doubt that makes him competitive out in California, but we'll see. I could see maybe some people liking him because some of the horses that were more fancied haven't been great as of late, but I would see. We don't know who's going to show up at this point, but if a horse like Echo Zulu did, or he's going to be in over his head.
Well, a 6-furlong dirt race that I think is getting people more excited for the future was run at the end of the day at Keeneland on Saturday, and that was won by the Steve Asmussen first-time starter Booth, son of Mitoli, Craig, who ran a really fast speed figure in his first start.
did. Unfortunately, I had tuned out after the previous race and didn't see this one live. And when I sat down to make speed figures that night, I was like, whoa, and I had to go back and watch it. And just a very fast race from a first time starting 2 year old, and Booth ran a 117 Timeform US speed figure. So just a point below what we saw from the older horse Hoist the Gold on Friday. So big impressive effort. And when I went back and watched it, it looked every bit as good visually as it did numerically.
Now, there were stories about horses coming into this race. The runner-up Nash was supposed to be a good one for trainer Brad Cox. He took a lot of the money in here, but Booth was just too quick for them at every step of this race. Broke sharply and then just extended his advantage in the stretch once asked for run by Ricardo Santana. And Craig, feels very similar to the debut effort that we saw from Extra Anejo, I think at this exact same meet around the same time of year last year at Keeneland. Obviously, that one went to the sidelines thereafter. We didn't see him for a while. Hopefully, they can get Booth on the track to be on the Kentucky Derby Trail next year, because he certainly looks like he might be that kind of horse. We'll see how far he wants to go as a son of Mitoli. We're still learning about what kind of sire Mitoli can be. He has had a few 2-year-olds do okay around 2 turns. One of them was Vivi's Dream, what we just talked about in the Alcibiades, the runner-up in that race. But obviously expected to be more of a sprint sire. On the dam side, though, there is pedigree for this horse to go longer. He's actually the younger half-brother to Jockey Club Gold Cup winner Bright Future.
Yeah, I mean that's a little too early for me to try to judge. He ran. I mean, I would say he looked like a sprinter, but who knows? It's hard to say with these 2 year olds. And I don't want to write off Nash off this race either. I thought he ran fine. He got a 108 Timeform US speed figure, which would probably win about 97% of these 2 year old maiden special weight races, even in October. So good, strong effort by him. And he's one I think would definitely be like some more distance.
Yeah, I would agree with that based on his pedigree. Well, Craig, let's stick with the 2-year-olds, but move over to Southern California to talk about some of their preps for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and Juvenile fillies that were run there last Saturday. The Grade 1 American Pharoah feature race on that card, and it was won by the Bob Baffert-trained heavy favorite Muth. We just had a double take before. I was mixing up Muth and Booth, but I did unintentionally put these horses back-to-back in the rundown. And this horse, Craig, was obviously beaten in his prior start as a heavy favorite. They had thought about running him in the Hopeful. I think even shipped him to Saratoga for that race, but Bob Baffert decided to wait for the American Pharoah and stretch him out around 2 turns, and it certainly paid off here, as now looks like he's going into that Breeders' Cup Juvenile as one of the favorites off this effort.
Yeah, I would imagine he will be one of the favorites. I don't have the official speed figure. I'm guessing he would get about a 115 for the effort, and visually it certainly looked that good. And I know I was happy as a speed figure guy that the this race and the Philly version of this race, the Chandelier, were both run on the same day, something they haven't been doing in the recent past. I think the Chandelier's been being run on Friday, so it was a pretty easy comparison. Unfortunately, they were the only 2 turn races on the card, so being all 2 year olds, not the easiest, but there was some pretty decent established form in these fields. So I'm pretty comfortable that the speed figure is going to be around that 115 mark, which stacks up pretty nicely to the 2 year olds we've already talked about.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how the bettors approach these 2 Bob Baffert horses in the Breeders' Cup. Obviously, Prince of Monaco skipped the American Pharoah. He had beaten Muth pretty convincingly in the Best Pal back in August, and it certainly seemed like he was the one that was maybe more inclined to go longer back then, but interesting that Bob Baffert chose Muth as the horse to try 2 turns first here, and now I think he's certainly risen in his place in the barn in terms of their rankings, and Prince of Monaco will be coming into the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, making his first start around 2 turns. So we'll be interested to see what we get from both of those horses in the race, Craig. But it certainly feels like sort of a toss-up among these 4 horses: Muth, Prince of Monaco, Timberlake, and Locked. They all are coming with very similar speed figures, different profiles, but the Breeders' Cup Juvenile is really going to decide the championship among them.
Yeah, and I mean, I was pretty impressed. I had talked about earlier how it's not always easy to handle that stretch out all the way to a mile and a 16th from just 6 furlongs, as we had seen from Muth, and he hadn't even won at 6 furlongs. His win came at shorter, so good effort. I don't know how strong the field it was in behind him. None of them were particularly fancied going in, and he won pretty easily, but no knocks on him. I mean, I did like what I saw Saturday.
Obviously, the Grade 2 Chandelier run earlier in the day, just a much slower race overall, which I think is consistent with what we've been seeing from the 2-year-old filly dirt horses in this division. And I guess you have to say, Craig, that the result of this race flatters Tamra, who is likely to be that strong favorite in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, because Shadowless finished a dozen lengths behind her in the Del Mar debutante and was able to get this Grade 2 win here in her prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, just leading every step of the way and controlling this race on the front end.
Yeah, it was a decent effort for her. Her speed figure actually regressed a little. I'm guessing going to be about a 97 based on that race and the time of the Muth race. So it's not the strongest race for sure, but like you mentioned earlier, who out there has been strong outside of Tamara, who ran that 117, winning the Del Mar debutante, and she does still have a little bit of that distance question. I know she's bred to like it, but you never know till they actually do it. But she's going to come into the race with a huge speed figure edge.
We'll move on to the Grade 2 Rodeo Drive, which was run a little bit later on this card, actually just before the American Pharoah. This one for the fillies and mares on the turf. And nice to see Didia get back to the winner's circle, Craig. I mean, this filly is just, or mare, I should say, has just been a win machine going all the way back to her South American career. I think she's now won 8 of her last 9 starts, was beaten, but put it forth a game tried in the New York earlier this year, and now came back for this fall campaign and was able to beat the horse that had been the star of this division in Southern California, at least among the 3-year-olds, Anizette, but it really never looked like this result was in doubt. Didia always had the jump on that rival.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big difference, 3-year-old versus older with turf horses, I think, and it kind of showed here. I know we've wondered on our shows in the past why more horses don't ship west because the turf horses are pretty weak division out there where Didia did it and she won easily. I would say even more easily than that length and 3/4 suggests. I'm guessing she's going to get right around the low 120s type TimeformUS speed figure, which she usually does run. And seems like whatever, maybe something went amiss since we hadn't seen her since late spring. But if something in fact did, it seems to have been corrected because she looked really good.
Yeah, and obviously a horse coming out of the Rodeo Drive is not going to be one of the favorites in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf, especially with a lot of Euros expected for that race, but this mare shows up every time, and you know she's going to try hard. She usually works out a good trip for herself, so she could be an interesting long shot heading into the Breeders' Cup. Then we've got a 2-year-old stakes race on Sunday, the Grade 3 Zuma Beach. This one a prep for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, and again, Craig, you consider these Southern California turf horses to typically be a cut below some of the East Coast counterparts, especially when it comes to the 2-year-olds, but Endlessly is running about as fast as some of the horses on the East Coast. He's undefeated, and he's already won over the Southern California turf courses, including at Santa Anita, so I guess he's a major player heading into the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf.
Yeah, I'm guessing he's going to get around the 96, 97 type speed figure. So I'll have that in a day or two. I see as we're talking, the figures for Saturday just came in, so I'll have those posted probably before people even listen to this. But yeah, Endlessly's fine. He has a decent amount of tactical speed. He certainly has a good finishing kick, and as you say, he's going to have that home court advantage being from the West Coast and now showing he can run over the Santa Anita course no problem.
And one more race to discuss from Southern California last week, going back to Friday, an allowance race which featured the return of Practical Move, the Santa Anita Derby winner from earlier in the season, a horse that was going to be among the favorites in the Kentucky Derby, but unfortunately forced to miss that race with a setback. And we were supposed to see him quite a bit before this, Craig. He must have had a series of setbacks because he's been on the shelf for a little while for trainer Tim Yakteen, but finally made it back to the races here and did what he was supposed to do in his return.
We did. I actually had missed this race somehow, and as I mentioned, I usually don't do speed figures for Santa Anita, so I was surprised when I saw an article in DRF about which race he's pointing to for the Breeders' Cup. I guess they're still talking Dirt Mile or Classic. He ran a 120 Timeform US speed figure, which is just a tick below what he did in the Santa Anita Derby. I'd be a little skeptical of this horse second race off a long layoff, but then again, we're seeing horses race less and less, so maybe some won't want to write him off. He's going to have to get a little faster than what we've seen.
Yeah, I certainly hope he runs in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile specifically. That race, aside from Cody's Wish, I don't know exactly who's pointing to that race this year. It feels like maybe it's a little bit thinner than it sometimes is. So I'd certainly like to see him in that race. He's got the kind of talent that should make him competitive in there. I didn't know what to make of the way this race was run, Craig. I mean, the pace line seems kind of crazy, but I guess the long run up for these mile races at Santa Anita does allow for a sub 22 opening quarter, though I don't fully believe that. But obviously they were moving up front, and some others just couldn't keep pace, and Practical Move was able to spurt away from these at the end. It was the right kind of return. I think we're going to see him move forward off this, and whether or not he moves forward enough to be competitive in a Breeders' Cup race remains to be seen. But like I said, that Dirt Mile might be the right kind of race you want to contest.
Yeah, for sure. I'll have to go check out the time of that race. It's one I didn't get to because, like I said, I didn't notice. It was a very fast track that day, and the run up is pretty crazy. I think it usually is around 200 feet, give or take a little bit. So they definitely get the fly in, but that one's a little odd. But I'll have to watch it. There were some decent older horses, not really stakes performers anymore. We've seen Tripoli and New Grange have success in stakes in the past, but not for a while. So, it's a tough effort to judge, in my opinion.
And then we'll finish things up at Woodbine, talking about their Canadian International Day card on Sunday in Canada. I don't know if any of these races are going to be Breeders' Cup preps, Craig. It sounds like, I haven't seen where all of the connections intend to go, but often these races aren't the most productive Breeders' Cup prep races. The Canadian International this year, they shortened it from a mile and a half to a mile and a quarter, and I guess that suited the winner of this race, Nation's Pride. It just seems like a lot of these races are tailor-made for the Charlie Appleby runners, and the shorter distance certainly made it right up Nation's Pride's alley, and he was able to win this race pretty convincingly over a good rival, Royal Champion, who is a nice horse in Europe, but just not quite of the same quality as Nation's Pride, and he was able to wear that foe down on the lane.
Yeah, and this wasn't the strongest race. I mean, at Hamo, I think maybe was the North American with the best resume. I hope it wasn't a foreshadowing of how dominant the Europeans are going to be in the Breeders' Cup because this was basically a two-horse race all the way around the track. It should be noted that the weather was not great. I think it was pouring down rain during this race. The next race we're going to talk about was also run at a mile and a quarter, but maybe a little tough to compare, though. When I looked at the worksheet, the projected variants were very, very similar for the two. So I'm not sure how my assistant's going to handle that, but they're going to come up pretty quick races. I would guess this one's going to get a Timeform US speed figure of right around the 130 range. But it's always worth taking them with a little bit grain of salt when you have a yielding course like this one.
Yeah, and as impressive as he was, Charlie Appleby has said coming out of this race, Nation's Pride is not being pointed to the Breeders' Cup. They don't think the turf is the right race for him, so he'll be going elsewhere on the globe. I think they're talking about going to potentially race in Bahrain over the winter. So we won't be seeing him in the U.S. again anytime soon. As for the Grade 1 EP Taylor, this one was won by Fev Rover, and nice to see her get back on track, Craig. She had won that Beverly D pretty convincingly over Gina Romantica when she enjoyed the pace advantage that day. In her return to Woodbine, she had been disappointing, getting beaten pretty decisively by Moira, but I think the turf condition really suited Fev Rover on this day.
Yeah, I think that probably had something to do with it. And we had thought Moira took a big step forward, and I think she did, but maybe it hindered her a little here as Fev Rover just there was no catching her. It's always tough to make up ground on these courses. This one was labeled as good. Like I said, it was a rainy day, but it was really raining before the boys race as opposed to this one. So not sure what the speed figure will be. I would guess it would be in the mid to like about a 127. So pretty big effort, but again, I would take that with a little bit of grain of salt given the course condition. But she did beat a pretty decent horse, and with the Moonlight, who we've seen here in the States a few times, and Moira as well, who had shown some good form in her last race.
And then the other graded stakes at Woodbine was that Nearctic 6 furlongs grade 2 event. And this one just an absolutely wild finish. I think 8 horses separated by an official 3/4 of a length at the wire. You rarely see races where they're that compacted at the finish line. Big Invasion, though, the favorite, just barely able to get the job done here. And he is a horse that always shows up and tries hard, and 6 furlongs is clearly the right kind of distance for him. I mean, I think that's why they went up to Woodbine, that and the fact that they were hoping to get a more suitable, firm turf course for him. That's the reason why they did not run at Aqueduct on Saturday. Obviously, that paid off because that race wasn't even run on the turf, the Belmont Turf Sprint. But they still got a pretty wet turf course to run over, but he was able to handle it just well enough to get the victory.
Yeah, and he ran basically the same speed figures he's been running since like his late in his 3-year-old season. This is a slight career top at 120, but he's run a slew of 118s, 119s, figures like that. So it was just good placement by Christophe Clement, a good ride by Dylan Davis. As I said, it's there was a slew of horses. It was one I was watching live, and I was like, wow, I think there's 8 horses across the wire, and I didn't realize it was actually 8. I was being a little sarcastic, but I doubt this race has any Breeders' Cup implications. None of these really seem like 5 furlong horses to me. This race totally fell apart. When you look at the top 5, they were all well back in the field early. So I don't have pace figures in front of me, but I would be surprised if at least a few of them aren't in red.
Yeah, I mean, I do think about Big Invasion as a horse that has had most of his success over those New York turf courses, but he has won 3 times going 5 furlongs on the turf at Gulfstream, so maybe he's a horse that's better suited to the Breeders' Cup than I'm giving him credit for, but I honestly haven't seen where the connections are intending to point him next, so we'll see if he even winds up in that race. Well, Craig, that wraps up a busy weekend of Breeders' Cup prep racing, and as we've kind of been talking about it, you can probably tell I'm getting a little excited for this Breeders' Cup. It just feels like these are going to be really fun races to handicap this year. I mean, they always are, but usually you get a few divisions that feel like they're determined ahead of time, some heavy favorites coming in. Not so in most of the divisions this year. It feels like there's a lot still to be determined in the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I can't really think of a race that may have a dominant favorite outside the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. Maybe the Sprint if Echo Zulu goes, so I don't know if she'd be a dominant favorite. So it's shaping up to be a fun Breeders' Cup. I don't know how historically great it'll be, but often we get surprised by some big performances we weren't expecting. So I am really looking forward to it, and I'm going this year, so I'm going to be there in person. So I hope it lives up to what we're expecting.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know that. That'll be a fun time for sure out in that Santa Anita. Well, Craig, thanks for recapping all these races with me. I know it was a lot to get through, but always fun to talk about this high-level racing action. And thanks to you for staying tuned until this point and listening to all of our musings on last week's racing. Craig and I, of course, will be back for the TimeformUS forecast next or at the end of this week. And haven't yet looked at the cards, Craig. I know Keeneland is already out, and I think they drew a pretty strong card for Saturday, so maybe we'll think about doing Keeneland again, especially given what the forecast is looking like in New York. I don't think Belmont at the Big A is going to be on our list of tracks to handicap for the forecast anytime soon, so maybe you can expect us to talk about another Keeneland Pick 5 later in the week. Again, everybody, thanks for listening. You can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening to the Pacecast, and make sure to catch that forecast coming up on Friday.